In the ancient, sun-baked deserts of Mesopotamia, a story of immense power and a horrific downfall unfolded, leaving an indelible mark on the Roman Empire for generations. Marcus Licinius Crassus, a man of immense wealth and influence, built his fortune through the suffering of others, only to find that his insatiable greed would become the very instrument of his demise. This is the tragic tale of how the gold that defined his life ultimately became the cause of his most gruesome death. The year was 53 B.C.E., and Rome's thirst for conquest was at its peak. The known world was uneasily governed by a triumvirate: Pompey the Great, Julius Caesar, and Marcus Crassus. While his partners were forging their legacies through military triumphs, Crassus was haunted by a deeply humiliating truth. He was seen as a mere financier among warriors. His vast riches, amassed through real estate and slave labor, bought him political power but failed to earn him the respect he craved. He watched as Caesar conquered Gaul and Pompey dominated the Mediterranean, their victories celebrated in Rome's marble halls, while his own accomplishments were measured only in currency. The constant sting of being called the third wheel of the triumvirate gnawed at him. At 60 years old, most men would have been content to retire and enjoy their wealth, but Crassus saw only one way to achieve true glory: a military conquest that would rival his famous allies. The Parthian Empire, a golden prize stretching from the Euphrates to the Indus, beckoned from beyond Rome's eastern frontier. This vast kingdom controlled the lucrative silk and spice routes connecting east and west. Crassus became convinced that conquering Parthia would not only bring him military glory, but also unimaginable wealth, enough to make his own immense fortune seem insignificant. Despite the Senate's suspicion of his ambitions and their refusal to grant a formal declaration of war, Crassus forged ahead. In 55 B.C.E., he arrived in Syria as governor and immediately began preparing for his grand invasion. He ignored the warnings of local commanders who understood Parthian military tactics, dismissing their concerns as cowardice. To him, the desert kingdoms had always fallen to Roman discipline and engineering, so why would Parthia be any different? His confidence was bolstered by intelligence reports suggesting internal strife within the Parthian court, making them appear vulnerable to a swift Roman strike. Crassus assembled a formidable force, 7 legions, nearly 40,000 men, supported by 4,000 cavalry and an equal number of light infantry. This was one of the largest expeditionary forces Rome had ever sent for an eastern conquest. Among his officers was his beloved son, Publius, a seasoned warrior who had served with distinction under Caesar in Gaul. The presence of his heir gave Crassus an additional motivation. This campaign would establish a dynasty of military glory. The invasion began in the spring of 53 B.C.E. with Roman forces crossing the Euphrates at Zeugma. Initial progress seemed to confirm Crassus's confidence. Local settlements either surrendered without a fight or were quickly taken by Roman siegecraft. The flat Mesopotamian terrain seemed perfect for Roman heavy infantry tactics, and early intelligence suggested that King Herodes II of Parthia was preoccupied with internal rebellions, leaving the frontier sparsely defended. However, Crassus's early success was a deliberate part of a cunning Parthian strategy. The young Parthian commander, General Surena, was intentionally luring the Romans deeper into the desert, away from their supply lines and into terrain that favored Parthian cavalry over Roman infantry. The few skirmishes that occurred were tactical retreats designed to instill false confidence in Crassus while exhausting his army with forced marches in the brutal heat. As the Roman army pushed further into the Mesopotamian desert, the true nature of their enemy began to reveal itself. The Parthians were not the disorganized barbarians of Roman propaganda, but a sophisticated military power with centuries of experience fighting in their homeland's harsh environment. Their army was built for mobility and ranged combat, featuring heavy cavalry known as cataphracts for shock attacks and lighter horse archers who could strike from incredible distances while remaining out of Roman reach. Surena's strategy exploited every weakness in Roman military doctrine. While Romans relied on close formation fighting, Parthians emphasized speed and flexibility. Where Romans expected decisive set-piece battles, the Parthians preferred harassment and attrition. Most crucially, while Romans assumed their enemies would eventually engage in direct combat, the Parthians were content to avoid confrontation and slowly bleed their opponents dry through constant skirmishing. The psychological warfare was just as advanced. Parthian scouts would appear on distant ridges, just visible enough to keep the Roman soldiers on edge, then vanish before any pursuit could be organized. Supply convoys came under attack from unseen enemies who struck without warning and disappeared into the vastness of the desert. Sleep became a luxury, as sentries reported strange sounds and movements throughout the night, leaving the entire army exhausted and paranoid. Crassus began to realize that his traditional Roman tactics were failing against this new type of warfare. His heavy infantry, invincible in the forests of Europe or along the Mediterranean coasts, struggled with the heat, the terrain, and the unconventional enemy tactics. The cavalry forces he had assembled were inadequate for the mobile warfare that defined the region, and his supply lines were increasingly vulnerable to Parthian raids that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The pivotal moment arrived at Carrhae, a small city in northern Mesopotamia, where Crassus decided to make his stand. The local geography seemed to favor his position. Hills provided defensive positions for his infantry, and a nearby water source would solve his supply problems. Intelligence reports suggested that Surena's main force was approaching, offering the decisive battle that Crassus believed would vindicate his entire campaign and demonstrate Roman superiority once and for all. The Battle of Carrhae began at dawn on June 9, 53 B.C.E. The Roman forces were arranged in their traditional formation: heavy infantry in the center, cavalry on the wings, and light troops screening the main force. Crassus positioned himself with the center, while his son Publius commanded the right-wing cavalry. The formation was an impressive sight in the morning light, with gleaming standards and polished armor, representing the finest military machine of the ancient world. Surena's approach, however, revealed the true brilliance of Parthian military science. The Romans were not facing a traditional army formation, but a purely cavalry force that moved like a single fluid organism across the desert floor. The Parthian heavy cavalry, armored from head to toe in gleaming metal scales, formed the center, while thousands of horse archers flowed around them like water, creating a constantly shifting tactical situation that Roman commanders could neither predict nor counter. The battle began with a massive Parthian arrow barrage that darkened the sky over the Roman formation. Unlike previous enemies who would quickly run out of ammunition, the Parthians had organized supply trains of fresh arrows, ensuring their archers were constantly supplied. Roman shields, designed to stop spears and swords, were no match for the sustained missile bombardment that continued for hours without a break, gradually wearing down Roman morale and effectiveness. Publius Crassus, young and eager to prove himself, made the fatal decision to break formation and charge the Parthian center with his cavalry wing. This played directly into Surena's strategy. The heavy cataphracts absorbed the Roman charge while horse archers surrounded the exposed cavalry force, cutting them off from the main army. Surrounded by enemies who struck from all sides, Publius's force was systematically annihilated in full view of his horrified father and the rest of the Roman army. The death of Publius was the psychological turning point of the battle. Surena's men severed the young man's head, mounted it on a spear, and paraded it before the Roman battle line while his father watched in stunned horror. The sight of his son's head bobbing above enemy ranks shattered whatever composure Crassus had managed to maintain. The confident general who had crossed the Euphrates months earlier was now a broken old man who could barely give coherent orders. Roman discipline began to crumble as the reality of their situation became clear. They were trapped in hostile territory, surrounded by an enemy who could strike at will while remaining out of reach. Water supplies were running low, the dead and wounded were piling up faster than they could be treated, and every attempt to break out resulted in heavier casualties. The desert that had seemed like an open highway to conquest had become a prison with no visible escape. As night fell, Crassus attempted to organize a retreat toward the nearby city of Carrhae, hoping that the urban terrain would neutralize the Parthian cavalry's advantages. However, the withdrawal turned into a chaotic rout as exhausted Roman soldiers abandoned their equipment and discipline in a desperate bid to reach safety. Thousands were cut down during the chaotic night march, while others simply collapsed from exhaustion and heat stroke, left behind by comrades who could barely save themselves. The remnants of Rome's great eastern army stumbled into Carrhae at dawn, having lost nearly half their strength in a single day of combat. The proud legions that had crossed the Euphrates were now a desperate mob of survivors, their standards lost, their confidence shattered, and their commander broken by grief and the magnitude of his failure. Crassus had gotten the decisive battle he wanted, but the outcome had been a complete catastrophe for him. Surena, instead of immediately assaulting the city, chose to demonstrate Parthian magnanimity by offering negotiations. He sent envoys under a flag of truce, proposing a meeting between commanders to discuss terms for a Roman withdrawal. The offer seemed reasonable. Both sides had suffered casualties, and the Parthians had made their point about Roman vulnerability. For Crassus, desperate to salvage something from the disaster, the proposal offered hope of saving at least some of his men. The meeting was arranged to take place on neutral ground between the two armies, with both commanders accompanied by small retinues. Despite warnings from subordinates who suspected treachery, Crassus agreed to the parley. His desperation to end the nightmare overcame his tactical judgment. He needed to believe that an honorable solution was possible, that his great gamble had not resulted in complete catastrophe for Rome and personal ruin for himself. What happened next is disputed by ancient historians, but the outcome was clear. The meeting erupted into violence, with Parthian soldiers overpowering the Roman delegation. Whether this was premeditated treachery or the result of misunderstandings, Crassus found himself a prisoner of the man who had destroyed his army and killed his son. The richest man in Rome was now entirely at the mercy of enemies who had every reason to despise what he represented. Surena's treatment of his captive revealed the depth of Parthian anger toward Roman ambitions. This was not merely a defeated general to be ransomed or executed quickly. Crassus represented everything the Parthians despised about Roman expansion. His invasion had been an unprovoked act of aggression motivated purely by greed and ambition, launched with no regard for Parthian sovereignty or the lives that would be lost in pursuit of his personal glory. The decision to execute Crassus in a manner befitting his character and crimes reflected both Parthian justice and their understanding of symbolic messaging. In a culture that valued honor and measured character by actions rather than wealth, Crassus embodied everything contemptible about Roman values. His death needed to send a message, not just to Rome, but to any future invaders who might mistake Parthian territories for easy conquests. The chosen method was both practical and deeply symbolic: molten gold. The very metal that had defined Crassus's life and motivated his disastrous invasion would become the instrument of his death. Parthian craftsmen heated gold until it became a liquid, a substance that would burn through human tissue while carrying a profound symbolic meaning. The man who had worshipped gold above all else would experience its true nature: beautiful but deadly, precious but ultimately destructive. The execution took place before an audience of Parthian nobles and captured Roman soldiers, making it both a judicial proceeding and a public demonstration. Crassus was forced to his knees as Parthian soldiers held his mouth open, preventing any last words or pleas for mercy. The molten gold was poured slowly, ensuring maximum suffering while creating a spectacle that would be remembered and discussed for generations throughout the ancient world. The physical agony was unimaginable. Liquid gold at temperatures exceeding 1,900 degrees Fahrenheit, burning through his mouth, throat, and internal organs while he remained conscious. But the symbolic message was equally important. The man who had valued gold above human life, who had built his fortune through exploitation and violence, was now experiencing gold's true nature as a destructive force. His worship of wealth had literally become his damnation. Witnesses described Crassus's final moments as a grotesque parody of his life's ambitions. The mouth that had spoken of conquest and glory was filled with the metal he had pursued across continents. The throat that had delivered speeches about Roman destiny was burned beyond recognition. The body that had enjoyed luxury beyond imagination was transformed into a powerful warning about the consequences of unchecked greed and ambition. The aftermath of Crassus's death sent shockwaves throughout the ancient world, extending far beyond the immediate military disaster. News of the execution reached Rome within weeks, creating panic among the ruling class, who suddenly realized that their eastern frontier was not secure and that their enemies possessed both the capability and the willingness to inflict humiliating defeats on Roman arms. The myth of Roman invincibility, carefully cultivated through centuries of expansion, had been shattered in the Mesopotamian desert. The political consequences within Rome were immediate and severe. The triumvirate that had dominated Roman politics for years was broken, leaving Pompey and Caesar as rivals rather than partners. Without Crassus's wealth and influence to balance their competing ambitions, the two remaining strongmen began the political maneuvering that would eventually lead to civil war and the end of the Roman Republic. In death, Crassus had inadvertently triggered the very conflicts he had sought to avoid through his eastern conquest. The Parthian treatment of other Roman prisoners demonstrated that Crassus's execution was not merely an act of sadistic cruelty, but part of a calculated strategy to deter future Roman aggression. Many surviving soldiers were settled in remote regions of the Parthian Empire, where they established communities and gradually assimilated into local populations. These former Romans served as living examples of Parthian mercy toward those who had not chosen war, a sharp contrast to the fate of their commander who had initiated the conflict. The symbolic resonance of Crassus's death extended throughout the ancient world, inspiring artists, writers, and philosophers for generations. The image of molten gold being poured into the mouth of Rome's richest man became a powerful metaphor for the dangers of excessive materialism and unchecked ambition. Plutarch, writing more than a century later, used the execution as a moral lesson about the corrupting influence of wealth and the inevitable consequences of hubris. Modern historians continue to debate the exact details of Crassus's death, with some questioning whether the molten gold story is literal truth or a symbolic representation. However, the broader historical significance remains clear. The execution marked a turning point in Roman expansion eastward and demonstrated that the empire's enemies were capable of sophisticated psychological warfare that went beyond mere military tactics. The manner of death, whether precisely accurate or not, captured essential truths about the conflict's meaning. The location of Crassus's remains became part of Parthian propaganda efforts, with his head allegedly sent to the court of King Herodes II, where it was used as a prop in theatrical performances mocking Roman pretensions. Some accounts suggest that Parthian actors used the severed head during performances of Euripides' Bacchae, with Crassus representing the tragic figure whose excessive ambitions led to his destruction. These theatrical presentations turned Roman defeat into ongoing entertainment for Parthian audiences. Archaeological evidence from the battlefield at Carrhae continues to yield insights into the scope of the Roman disaster, with weapons, armor fragments, and skeletal remains painting a picture of complete military catastrophe. The artifacts tell the story of a professional army that was systematically destroyed by enemies who understood both the tactical situation and the psychological dimensions of warfare. Roman military manuals were revised based on lessons learned from the defeat, but the damage to imperial prestige could never be fully repaired. The legacy of Crassus's death influenced Roman foreign policy for decades, making subsequent emperors more cautious about Eastern adventures and more respectful of Parthian military capabilities. The disaster demonstrated that Rome's enemies were not simply barbarian tribes to be conquered through superior discipline and engineering, but sophisticated civilizations with their own military traditions and strategic thinking. This recognition marked the beginning of a more mature phase in Roman expansion that emphasized diplomacy alongside military force. The story of Marcus Crassus serves as a timeless warning about the dangers of allowing personal ambition to override wisdom and restraint. His transformation from a successful businessman to a military disaster illustrates how individual character flaws can have consequences far beyond personal failure, affecting entire civilizations and altering the course of history. The molten gold that killed him remains a powerful symbol of how the things we desire most intensely can become the instruments of our destruction. In our modern world, where wealth inequality and political ambition continue to shape global events, the death of Crassus offers sobering lessons about the relationship between power and responsibility. His story reminds us that true leadership requires more than accumulating resources or achieving tactical victories. It demands wisdom, empathy, and an understanding of the broader consequences of our actions. The golden throat that silenced Rome's richest man continues to whisper warnings across the centuries about the price of unchecked greed and the importance of knowing when enough is truly enough.